Hello, my name is Richard Hale. Tonight proved that silence can be dignity, but when it's weaponized against you, speaking out becomes justice. My daughter saw the truth, and the family that tried to shame me was left to face their own collapse. If there's one lesson I've learned, it's this. No arrogance can outrun the weight of truth, and no man should bow to injustice. Perhaps standing up today means you'll never again have to bow tomorrow. I never thought the happiest day of my daughter's life would begin with my humiliation. The words ran through my head as the crystal chandeliers glimmered above, spilling their golden light across the polished parquet of the Grand Marlowe Estate ballroom. The July evening was thick with chatter, the clink of champagne flutes and the rustle of silk gowns brushing against marble. I straightened the lapels of my modest suit before stepping fully into the glow, offering a quiet smile as Emily hurried toward me. "Dad," she whispered, her hands fidgeting as she kissed my cheek quickly, eyes darting toward the others. She looked beautiful, nervous and fragile all at once. For a brief moment, I let myself recall how far we had come since I'd left Wall Street. I had traded skyscrapers and shouting brokers for the silence of early mornings and the anonymity of quiet neighborhoods. Most people assumed I had vanished into irrelevance, a retired man who had outlived his usefulness. They didn't know the truth that I still held levers of power, tucked away threads in the financial tapestry, invisible to these gilded walls. The cool weight of the small key in my pocket was proof enough, though no one here would guess what it unlocked. The Cole family had arranged this rehearsal dinner, with all the grace of nobility presiding over peasants. Every guest seemed carefully curated, every toast choreographed. Yet when I walked in, conversation's dipped eyes flicked my way, and the tiniest whispers spread like wildfire. I knew what they saw. Not wealth, not influence, but a man whose shoes were plain, whose suit bore no designer label, whose tie had no sheen. Emily's fiancé, Brandon, was already in the middle of holding court. He stood tall, radiating smugness, his laughter slicing through the room. His parents, Charles and Victoria, hovered nearby, elegant, crisp, their gazes cool, as if they measured me like an antique they found unimpressive. As I approached, Brandon's grin widened, the kind that invited cruelty. "Well, Richard," he said loud enough for the tables nearby to hear, "I see you've brought your minimalist style to the party." He glanced at my shoes, polished but simple. "Tell me, do those come from a clearance rack downtown? Must be quite the bargain." Guests chuckled softly, their laughter masked behind champagne. Emily stiffened beside him, biting her lip. Her eyes flickered to me and away, as if ashamed of both his words and her silence. I let the insult roll off, though I felt the sting in the marrow of my bones. I had endured worse in boardrooms where millions were at stake. Still, this wasn't business. This was family, and that cut deeper. Brandon wasn't finished. He raised his glass, and with a smirk, said, "You know, Emily, your father looks a little out of place tonight, like a beggar who wandered into a gala. I mean, really, doesn't he look like a tramp among us?" The words hit the ballroom like a shard of glass breaking. The laughter quieted, and for a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the orchestra rehearsing faintly in the background. Emily's shoulders curled inward. She lowered her gaze. Her cheeks flushed crimson, but she said nothing. Charles and Victoria stood silent, unmoved. They did not rebuke their son. They let the remark hang in the air like smoke, as though it belonged, as though it was true. I looked around, catching the flicker of sympathetic smiles, the quick shifts of eyes avoiding mine. No one dared speak. My humiliation was a performance, and the audience was complicit. I inhaled slowly, steadying the storm inside me. My expression did not falter. I gave them nothing to feed on. Instead, I leaned ever so slightly toward Brandon, my voice low, calm, the edge sharp as tempered steel. "Enjoy tonight, Brandon," I said evenly. "Weddings are always full of surprises." He blinked, perhaps expecting anger, perhaps expecting me to walk away crushed. Instead, he found only the steady gaze of a man who had weathered storms larger than his petty arrogance. The orchestra struck a new note, and the clinking of glasses resumed. The world moved on, though I remained still, letting the fire settle beneath layers of composure. Emily glanced up briefly, her eyes glassy, then turned away, swallowed by the tide of guests and obligations. I drifted toward the balcony. The cool night air washed over me as I stepped outside, leaving behind the chatter and the cloying perfume. Lights from the Hudson shimmered in the distance, a reminder of the city I once ruled in silence. My hand slipped into my pocket fingers, brushing the ridges of the small key. Its presence steadied me. It was not just metal. It was a promise, a reminder that tonight's insult was only the opening act. Not yet, I thought. I exhaled calm and deliberate, and let the sounds of laughter and champagne fade behind me. There was more to come, and they would never see it until it was too late. A single insult fades with time, but the humiliation inflicted by family lingers like a scar. The morning light filtered through the curtains of my hotel room, casting long stripes across the carpet. Outside, New York hummed with the restless anticipation of celebration, but within these four walls, silence reigned, the kind that steadied me, sharpened me. I preferred it this way. Peace before chaos, calm before the storm. I sat in the armchair polishing the silver cufflinks Emily had given me for my 50th birthday. They gleamed faintly in my hands, catching the sun just enough to remind me of what mattered. Yet no matter how carefully I cleaned them, Brandon's words from last night clung to me like smoke, a beggar among us. That sting was sharp, but it wasn't his arrogance that burned. It was Emily's silence. Her downcast eyes had pierced deeper than his taunts. Children are supposed to shield you, defend you when the world turns cruel. But she had lowered her gaze, retreating into complicity. That I knew would not be forgotten. A soft knock broke the stillness. I rose, slid the cufflinks into place, and opened the door. Daniel Reed stepped inside, his expression carrying both familiarity and resolve. His presence was grounding. He had once been a casualty of the coal empire, a man they had trampled over in their climb. That history bound us closer than friendship ever could. He offered me a sealed envelope. "It's all here," he said. His voice was quiet, respectful. "Every record of the anonymous donations you made these past years. The MC will have no choice but to read them aloud once the timing is right." I nodded, tucking the envelope beside the neatly folded pocket square on the table. "Perfect," I murmured. "They'll never see it coming." Daniel's mouth curled into the faintest grin. He placed a small leather case beside the envelope, and this he added for "when you're ready." He didn't need to explain. The gleam of the key fob resting within spoke for itself. Before we could continue, there was another knock, this one brisk, businesslike. Mrs. Porter, the hotel's manager, entered with the cautious grace of someone who had learned to deliver unpleasant news gently. "Mr. Hale," she began, smoothing her skirt. "I thought it best you hear this from me, before the wedding coordinator does. There's been a few adjustments." I gestured for her to continue. "Your seat has been moved," she said carefully. "You'll no longer be at the family table. They've placed you at one of the back rows, with the distant relatives." Her voice softened. "And your speech, The one you'd planned to give after the vows has been removed from the program. They said it was due to scheduling constraints. Her eyes flickered with sympathy, as if she knew the cruelty beneath the polite phrasing. I inclined my head, expression unchanging. Thank you, Mrs. Porter. That will be all. She hesitated, then bowed slightly and left. Daniel let out a low, sardonic laugh once the door clicked shut. They think they've boxed you in, humiliated you into silence. Clever if you were a man who played their game. He leaned back against the desk, folding his arms. But you're not, are you? You're still holding the key. I didn't answer, only let my gaze fall to the Rolls-Royce key on the table. Its black enamel surface gleamed like a pawn piece, waiting to become a queen. I reached instead for the documents in the envelope, sliding one free. The paper was crisp, the ink undeniable. Years of carefully disguised philanthropy, now ready to be revealed in my daughter's name. Not my name, hers. Let them laugh at me all they wanted. The stage was being set for Emily to stand in the light, while the Coles basked in the illusion of dominance. At noon, with deliberate calm, I signed the authorization. A donation sizable enough to fund scholarships, rebuild clinics, establish futures, all attributed to her. The signature was neat, steady, a move in a chess game where the board was already tilting in my favor. Daniel watched me carefully. Timing. During the cake cutting, I said, when the cameras are out, when the attention is absolute, they'll have no choice but to listen. The air vibrated, faintly punctuated by the buzz of Daniel's phone. He glanced at the screen, raised his brows, then held it out to me. Cole Industries, he said. They're trying to buy into the Whitaker Foundation. They think it's unclaimed. They're asking when they can meet the owner. I let a small smile play at my lips. And what did you tell them, I asked, if you wanted me to reveal your name? The hum of the city seemed to press in around us, as if waiting for my answer. My eyes fell once more to the Rolls-Royce key. Patience was everything. Not yet, I replied. Daniel smirked. I thought you'd say that. I leaned back into the armchair, letting silence fill the room again. The Coles were certain they'd stripped me of dignity, that they'd written me out of my own daughter's life. Let them think it. Every illusion they spun only tightened the trap. I closed my eyes briefly, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner, the muffled laughter drifting in from the hallway where the Coles prepared their performance. Let them have their morning. The afternoon belonged to me. A wedding hall can become a battlefield when pride dictates the seating. By noon, the ballroom had been remade into a glittering stage, orchids cascading from tall crystal vases, linen white as snowfall, a string quartet rehearsing something elegant and forgettable. The place glowed, but the shine was only surface. Beneath it, tension moved like a current under ice. An usher met me with a tight smile and a folded card. He didn't need to speak. The way his eyes skipped off mine did the talking. My name had been printed and replanted, no longer at the family table near the dais, but back near the service doors, where steam from the kitchen curled into the air like ghostly sighs. I accepted the new seat without comment. The table back here gathered the distant relatives and the people you invite, because it would be impolite not to. The clatter of trays behind us framed every conversation. Waiters ghosted past in a blur of black vests and silver platters. A few guests gave me sympathetic smiles, the kind born not of courage, but of relief that their own names were safe on better cards. From this vantage, I could see everything that mattered. The Coles moved across the room like proprietor's Charles, with his banker's posture and thin smile. Victoria in a sheath dress that broadcast severity more than grace. Their son Brandon, my soon-to-be son-in-law, lapped up attention as if it were proof of oxygen. Emily stood at his side, glowing and nervous, beautiful, as always, her fingers worrying the hem of her bouquet ribbon when she thought no one was watching. I noticed everything because I had trained myself to notice. People tell their truths in gestures long before they find the words. Photographers flitted like sparrows' lenses, catching angles of joy and proof of taste. Whenever a flash cracked, I lifted my eyes to meet the camera. Not to pose, just to let the record show that I had been here, seen the play, kept my counsel. If dignity was a currency, I intended to spend it precisely. The ceremony passed in a tide of vows and applause. Then came the toasts, the part where families translate affection into public theater. Brandon took the microphone as though it were an heirloom he'd always owned. The murmurs lowered, cutlery rested. Every light in the room seemed to find him. He smiled, practiced and bright. What a day! He began, voice gliding on the microphone. What a miracle that two people from such different worlds can find each other. Laughter soft and easy. He turned, put an arm around Emily. My wife's humble roots remind me love can cross any class divide. The chuckles that followed were brittle, the kind that break in your hand. I watched Emily, tense eyes flicking to me and away. She didn't speak. Of course she didn't. Pride, fear, momentum. Pick any strand and you'll find silence is the knot that holds them together. Victoria drifted toward the stage steps, while the applause sputtered, her face composed into a diplomatic mask. She touched the MC's arm, leaning in, with the grace of someone asking for a favor she'd already decided would be granted. The MC nodded twice, mouth tightening, and shuffled his note cards. My name, once slotted after the maid of honor, slid out of the program without a sound. A waiter offered me wine. I accepted, sipped, and fixed my eyes on the dais. Let them think they'd erased me. Absence can carry more weight than presence if you know what to do with it. The photographers organized the first round of family frames. The Coles arranged themselves in practiced geometry near the floral arch. Tall in back, delicate in front, Brandon in the center, as if the room revolved around him by law. When someone called for the bride's father, an usher beckoned me forward from the kitchen's shadow. I walked up slowly, felt the measure of stairs, and took my place at the edge of the constellation. Brandon's arm tightened around Emily's waist. "Let's keep it tight," he told the photographer, then shot me a sideways smile. "We'll crop him out later." It takes a certain breed of arrogance to say something like that into a microphone disguised as a camera. The photographer glanced at me, uncomfortable, but did as he was told, angling, nudging, trimming the frame until my shoulder hovered near the margin, like an afterthought. Emily's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. Her eyes begged pardon, with a helplessness that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with the gravity of a spectacle that had chosen its own orbit. I nodded once, a signal to her and to myself that I was neither surprised nor wounded beyond repair. It is easier to be cut when you still believe the blade is accidental. While the group reset for the next pose, I stepped back to my table. The kitchen doors swung, releasing a warm pulse of rosemary and butter. At the far end of the room, Charles conferred with the event planner. Victoria inspected the place cards with the attitude of a customs officer. When you spend enough time in boardrooms, you learn that power loves choreography, where people stand, how long they speak, who gets the last word. The Coles had transformed a wedding into a flowchart, and I had been filed near the bottom margin. The MC returned to the lectern to introduce the best man. I felt the eyes of a few guests swing toward me, curiosity pricking through their restraint. They wanted a reaction. I obliged them with none. The quartet resumed a polished melody. Forks chimed. Silver domes lifted to reveal perfect plates. The machine of celebration ground on. A photographer broke from the flock and circled to my side of the room. The flash caught me in profile glass in hand. For a heartbeat, the world froze in white. When my vision cleared, he was lowering the camera, a faint crease between his brows. He had seen something, maybe resolve, maybe patience, maybe a contour the Coles had not accounted for. In any case, the lens had recorded it. That would be enough. Then the next act of humiliations arrived, with sugar on top. A junior planner, cheeks pink with embarrassment, approached and apologized that there had been a small oversight in the printed program. We had to streamline, she said. To keep the schedule tight. She meant you were cut. I spared her the indignity of forcing the euphemism into truth. Don't worry, I said. I won't hold up the show. The best man finished. The maid of honor stumbled adorably through tears, and laughter washed everything clean for everyone but me. The camera flashes grew more frequent as sunlight angled through the tall windows, turning dust into glitter. Each flare froze another moment I had no intention of forgetting. Family pictures, someone called again. This set demanded the entire Hale Cole constellation, grandparents, cousins, siblings all spun around the newlyweds like moons. I stepped back into the arrangement when summoned and felt Brandon's hand guide, then push the space I was allotted. The photographer, working fast, pleaded for people to squeeze in. Brandon's shoulder bumped mine once, then again, a little shove masquerading as a joke. Tighter, he said brightly. We're not fitting everyone. We'll make room, I replied, and stayed steady where I was. He tried for the third nudge, and met nothing but the firm geometry of a man who'd already made up his mind. He let it go with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Emily stood between us, spine drawn like a string. I watched her mouth form the beginning of my name, then die on air. No rescue arrived. It wasn't coming. That was fine. In chess, you do not complain that your opponent moves their pieces. You simply play the board you're given and wait for the moment the board belongs to you. The photographer announced a final shot and checked his settings. I saw my own reflection in the camera's glass. Calm, still a silhouette that refused to shrink. Applause followed the last click. The guests scattered toward coffee and conversation. The quartet launched into something sprightly. I returned to my table by the service doors. A waiter set a fresh glass at my elbow, with a look that said he'd seen worse and admired better. I lifted the drink to him in quiet thanks. Little alliances matter. My phone vibrated once against my ribcage. I took it out beneath the tablecloth, half shielded by the drift of a linen napkin. Camera shutters kept popping. The room's attention was busy photographing itself. On the screen, a message banner from a name I trusted more than the rest of this hall combined. Car is in position. Whitaker himself is waiting in the lobby. Richard slips the phone back into his jacket, unflinching. Sometimes the sharpest blade comes wrapped in velvet and tied with ribbon. By late afternoon, the ballroom swelled again, the tide of music and laughter cresting as waiters rolled out the towering white confection that was the wedding cake. 5 tiers frosted like porcelain sugar roses curling upward like marble flames. Guests surged forward, phones lifted, champagne refreshed. The Coles stood at the heart of the spectacle. Brandon, with a hand welded to the microphone, Charles and Victoria flanking him like generals overseeing a coronation. He tapped the mic with the same smugness he wore like cologne. Ladies and gentlemen. Brandon began, voice buoyed by champagne and arrogance. Today is about unity, prosperity, and if I may say, making the best deal of one's life. He raised his glass eyes, sparkling with practiced humor, to marrying up. The room responded with a ripple of laughter, brittle and uneven, but laughter nonetheless. Brandon basked in it, as though applause were sunlight. Emily at his side smiled dutifully, but her grip on the knife ribbon twitched. Near the back of the hall, I sipped slowly, the cold rim of the glass steady against my lips. Let them perform. Let them tighten the noose of their own making. Then at the dais, the master of ceremonies cleared his throat. He looked off balance. In his hands rested a sealed envelope white against the black of his tuxedo. He shuffled note cards, nervously glanced toward Victoria, who frowned as if this detail had not been approved. Before we cut the cake, the MC announced his voice. Careful, there is a special announcement that has just come through. He broke the seal. A hush descended, curious murmurs filling the edges of silence. He read aloud. On behalf of an anonymous donor, we are pleased to announce a gift of $2 million to establish the Emily Hale Foundation for Pediatric Care at St. Mary's Hospital. The words detonated in the room. Champagne flutes froze mid-air. Conversations strangled into silence. Cameras snapped like fireworks trying to capture the exact second disbelief turned to awe. The doors at the back opened, and a representative from St. Mary's stepped inside, cradling a mahogany plaque etched in silver. He mounted the stage, offered it first to the bride, then turned it outward for the crowd. Across the polished wood, the inscription shone clear: the Emily Hale Foundation, gifted in honor of family legacy and healing. At the bottom, unmistakable, presented by Richard Hale. 1,000 eyes rotated at once, their beams of speculation, astonishment, and gossip converging toward me, seated near the service doors, half shadowed by linen and candlelight. I didn't rise. I didn't bow. I merely inclined my head, once the gesture neither boastful nor meek. The flashbulbs loved it. The room trembled with whispers. Brandon's grin cracked his face pale enough to make the ivory cake blush, by comparison. Charles exchanged a rapid look with Victoria, something between fury and calculation. Their fingers tightened around their glasses, the control they prided themselves on slipping grain by grain. And Emily, my daughter, stood frozen knife in hand, staring at me with eyes wide, not from anger, but from dawning recognition. Her breath caught her lips parting, as if the words had been waiting years to surface. I was wrong about him. The applause began hesitantly, then swelled, first polite, then enthusiastic, the sound of a crowd grateful for something untainted by arrogance. Photographers flooded forward, demanding Emily lift the plaque for the cameras. She obeyed, mechanically gaze, never leaving mine across the hall. I finished my drink. The cutlery clattered faintly as waiters steadied their trays. The performance had shifted stages, and the Coles no longer owned the script. My phone buzzed once against my palm. Daniel's message lit the screen. Phase 1 complete. Rolls-Royce in 5 minutes. I set the glass down the stem, kissing the linen softly. My eyes lifted from the table to the grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom. Somewhere beyond them waited the next move. The cake, untouched, gleamed under chandeliers. The crowd murmured with a different energy, now hungry not for sugar, but for story. And I, patient as always, prepared to step through the opening I had carved. Some truths don't arrive quietly. They roar down the drive and idle beneath the chandeliers. The ballroom still trembled with the aftershock of the donation announcement when another sound cut through the murmurs. The growl of an engine, low and commanding, reverberating through the glass facade. Heads turned toward the entrance, Even the orchestra faltered bows, hovering midair. The massive glass doors shuddered open, and a silhouette of chrome and midnight blue rolled into view. A Rolls-Royce Phantom Collector's Edition, long hood gleaming under the dying sun, slid to a stop at the crimson carpet. The hush thickened. For a heartbeat, the scene resembled a royal arrival rather than a wedding. The driver stepped out with precision, walked to the rear, and pulled the door open. Slowly, unhurried, I emerged. My shoes met the carpet with a muted thud that carried farther than Brandon's loudest toast. The whispers scattered like sparks. Is that his? Did he just arrive in that car? I thought they said he was struggling. Phones rose like a tide lenses flashing. I didn't wave. I didn't acknowledge. I simply straightened the cuffs of my jacket, the calm, in a storm they hadn't yet understood. Daniel appeared at my side, sharp in his navy suit voice, carrying just enough to reach the half-circle of guests craning forward. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Richard Hale, principal stakeholder of the Whitaker Trust benefactor, of St. Mary's, and Rolls-Royce patron for over 20 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and then, as if scripted, a distinguished figure detached himself from the cluster of onlookers, silver hair charcoal suit presence, radiating authority. Mr. Whitaker himself, chairman of Rolls-Royce. He clasped my hand firmly, then turned to address the gathering. This vehicle, Whitaker declared his baritone resonant, is one of only 10 in existence, and it belongs to Mr. Hale. The words struck like a gavel. The ballroom doors behind us spilled guests into the lobby, their curiosity uncontrollable. Photographers surged forward, snapping the handshake the car, my still expression. Brandon forced his way to the front, jaw-tight smile splintering. Money doesn't buy respect. He spat volume higher than necessary, trembling with desperation. It's not about cars or checks. I looked at him evenly, my voice calm enough to silence the surrounding whispers. You're right. Respect isn't bought. It's earned, built in silence, in choices, in integrity. But arrogance, I let the pause sharpen. Arrogance destroys it in an instant. The applause broke like thunder. Some clapped hesitantly, others with vigor, grateful to puncture the smug veneer the coals had plastered over the day. Brandon froze in the storm of its lips, working without sound. Charles and Victoria exchanged frantic glances, their polished armor cracking. For once, control slipped from their grasp entirely. Emily stood half-hidden in the doorway, her face, pale eyes, bright with something rawer than shock. Guilt, perhaps, or realization. Her gaze searched for mine, as if measuring the weight of every moment she had stood silent while they cut me down. I shifted toward her, the crowd parting with its own momentum. Emily, I said, just loud enough for those closest to hear, but soft enough that the intimacy was unmistakable. This isn't about money. It isn't about cars. Tonight, you'll learn what truly defines family. I left her with that, no lecture, no raised voice, just the words and the silence they carried. Then I turned, walked back inside with Daniel and Whitaker at my flanks. Behind me, Brandon wilted under the eyes of his own guests, a man suddenly small in the shadow of something he had never anticipated. And ahead, the final curtain waiting to fall. Victory doesn't always roar. It sometimes arrives with the quiet clink of a glass. The evening crowd pressed back into the ballroom, as if the day had rewound itself, but nothing was the same. Conversations broke and stitched themselves together in quick threads. Glances ricocheted from the doors to the dais and back again. The orchestra chose restraint over flourish, filling the ceiling with music that made room for whispers. I entered at an unhurried pace, with Daniel a step behind, and Mr. Whitaker pausing to greet a knot of guests, who suddenly realized they had reasons to be polite. In my left hand, I carried a leather folder still closed, the spine warm against my palm. Brandon was already angling toward the microphone. He looked different under this version of light, thinner somehow, as if the applause earlier had been a suit of armor he could no longer find. Charles and Victoria stood off to the side, their faces arranged into something that was not quite composure and not quite surrender. The guests drew into a crescent, leaving a clear aisle between the doors and the stage. I didn't take the aisle. I chose a table near the front, instead, set the folder on the linen, and let the room adjust to my refusal to chase its attention. It came to me anyway. Brandon cleared his throat, forcing a grin. "A car and a check don't erase years of mediocrity," he announced too loudly, as if volume could turn opinion. "Anyone can rent a show. Substance is another matter." The silence he expected did not arrive. Instead, the crowd's noise thinned to a taut strand, waiting. I rose and lifted the leather folder, easing the brass clasp open with the smallest click. The MC, who had cut my name in the afternoon, instinctively stepped back from the microphone. Old habits. They know when power is about to change hands. I laid the contents on the table one by one, like a surgeon displaying instruments, and only then turned toward the nearest cameras. The first sheet was a letter of recognition from a global firm, whose name even the Coles would not pretend to misunderstand, countersigned by 3 people who did not lend signatures cheaply. The second was a photograph, grainy by design, of me standing off stage at a gala under no spotlight at all, the caption crediting an anonymous benefactor for underwriting a clinic wing. The third document detailed holdings in the very fund the Coles had tried to buy, the one they had assumed was unclaimed percentage ownership, time-stamped acquisitions, a legal note linking it to a parent entity no one in this room had thought to look for. I spoke softly, and the hush moved with my voice. "I stayed silent because I don't require applause," I said. But when my daughter was shamed, silence ceased to be strength, it became cowardice. And I will never be a coward. Cameras clicked. Somewhere near the back, a glass touched a plate and sounded like a bell. Brandon tried for a laugh that landed as a cough. "You think paper proves character?" he shot back, pushing past his parents' fingertips where they tried to hold him by the sleeve. "You think a few letters and pictures make you a better man. You hid behind anonymity. At least I own who I am." "Do you?" Daniel's voice carried cleanly from my right. He stepped forward, not so close as to posture, not so far as to be ignorable. "When your family forced me out of a deal to tighten your own margins, Richard backed me when no one else would take the call. You called him a beggar. He's the man your empire has feared in silence." Whitaker did not add words. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, the kind of witness who turns a room into a ledger. The faces around us told the rest, surprise melting into assessment, then into something like respect. I gathered the papers again, not to hide them, but to prove they could be put away without losing their weight. Emily stood a few steps from the edge of the stage, her hands still, her eyes fixed on me, with a steadiness I hadn't seen all day. It wasn't the glitter of ceremony anymore. It was something older, truer. Brandon tried again, flinging gravel where there was no road. "This is theater," he said, desperate now. "A stunt. A bid for sympathy dressed like virtue." "No," I said. "It's accountability. There's a difference." The room inhaled. Nothing moved. Then Emily moved. She broke from the neat geometry of the bridal party and crossed the floor, the way a person crosses a line they cannot uncross. Her dress whispered against the parquet. The chandeliers stitched light into her hair. She didn't ask permission from anyone's eyes. When she reached me, she took my hand with both of hers, squeezing it hard enough to anchor us both. "I am proud to be your daughter," she said. What followed was not polite applause. It was standing uncoordinated, a sound that rolled forward in waves and erased the small, mean echoes that had filled the day. Chairs pushed back, napkins fell, people clapped, because sometimes the only answer to arrogance is an honest noise. Charles touched Brandon's shoulder. Victoria touched his other. Together they turned him away from the center of the room, their faces chalk pale in the chandelier light. For all their stagecraft, they understood exits. The MC looked as if he might speak, then decided against it. Daniel exhaled a breath he'd been holding for years. Whitaker gave me a single nod that meant more than most speeches. I glanced at Emily. She didn't let go of my hand. I lifted my glass, feeling the weight of the day slide into place behind the words I'd saved for last. Here's to dignity, the only inheritance that cannot be stolen, and the only wealth that never fades. As the applause swells, the Rolls-Royce headlights cut through the ballroom glass, gleaming like a final seal of justice.